Thank you for joining us for the Community Engagement and Stakeholders Participation session here. We'll go ahead and get started this morning with our presentations. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists this morning. First, beginning with Josh Moaning with New Power Nebraska. Sitting next to Josh is Jeff Danielson with the America Wind Energy Association. And next to him is Brad Wilken with Olsson. And next to Brad is Mike Laird with Olsson as well. Again, this is the stakeholder engagement and buy-in session. Each of our panelists will be reviewing from a national scale, moving into Nebraska, how to engage stakeholders and gain buy-in for wind and solar projects. And we'll begin with Jeff Danielson with AWEA.
So thank you, Amanda. Thank you to the participants who chose this panel. It's an honor to be here. I'm Jeff Danielson, the Central Region Director for the American Wind Energy Association. Let's see if I've got this right. Yep. So AWEA has over 1,000 member companies, including Olsson, and some of the other panelist companies that you've seen who've already participated in the Wind and Solar Conference. We do it all, from the manufacturing supply chain to the construction stage, development, back office, operations and maintenance. And so I think it's important to know that AWEA has wind in our name, but don't let that fool you. Our companies do solar, storage, transmission, and we have utilities who are member companies as well who own other traditional sources of generation. So we tend to see all of the arguments about generation and energy and put our best foot forward on how to make the case, obviously for renewables, but also understanding how that impacts other decisions as well. Of note, I'm surprised this hasn't been mentioned yet in any of the presentations that I've seen so far. Wind turbine techs are the second fastest growing job in the United States. Solar install technicians is number one. And if you look at the overall top 10, it's not even really close between the top two and the next ones that follow. So clearly a high growth field. You may have seen this. We employ over 100,000 Americans around the country. And then why is Nebraska important? You have a wonderful wind resource, as well as solar in the southern part of the state. So this is why there is a lot of interest in Nebraska and why AWEA considers it a priority state in order to support our member companies and the stakeholders and the decision makers. Wind power capacity, just to give you kind of the sense, obviously the Midwest tends to be the wind capital of the world, and Nebraska sits right in the center of that with tremendous resources and already a lot of capacity built in one of the fastest growing states. Another macro stat, wind energy provides 6.5% of electricity in the United States. Nebraska has over 14% of the electricity generated, and then you can compare it to some peer states. So there's been some talk about how can Nebraska improve that, and this panel certainly will delve into that through a community stakeholder standpoint. Under capacity, under construction or in advanced development, this is a peek into the future. These are real live projects that our member companies are working on and hope to put into the ground and make operational. And so Nebraska, relative to its peers and other states around the country, is clearly in the top tier of states where development is underway. There's sort of a geographical map to depict that same statistic. Here are the second quarter stats, and I think it's really interesting in the energy world right now is by the time you do a slide deck, it's already out of date. So AWEA has changed. Actually, this is a second quarter report that we did for our member companies. We have a technology called Wind IQ that provides our member companies information, and we have just adjusted so that it is near real time for our member companies. So even we, as an information source, have changed from sort of quarterly reporting to try to make sure that that's real time, up to date to them. So this is second quarter. Clearly, a lot of interest in Nebraska and a lot of growth potential. Here's some of the indirect benefits, 3,000 to 4,000 direct jobs. And then you've heard some of these other numbers reiterated in some of the other presentations. Additional economic benefits that obviously those that work on economic development consider important, sort of your amplified effects of that development, and there's how some of the national comparisons play out state to state. What's driving all of that? You've heard this reiterated again. Costs are coming down so that it's not just environmental or other concerns. You actually have the ability to save money and plan for the future in a way that you had not in the past through renewables. And that's across both wind, solar, and you heard presentations about storage as well. Very important aspect to the market driver. This is, you may have heard this described a couple different ways, commercial and industrial investment in wind. But this is a very interesting chart that kind of shows you the growth of those corporate purchasers and some of the nameplate companies that are interested in wind development. We see no slowing of this growth, even post federal tax policy, whether it stays the same or changes. This is a driver in the market that will continue to attract investment money, and in the states that have good policies, we'll see some of this growth. For those of us that have been in policy for a while, these kind of charts are fairly dramatic. For a field in which energy may have been a long-term planning policy and that the decision makers are really looking over the long haul, you are seeing rapid changes in energy, and this is one of the reasons. These are companies who are not in the energy business, but who are trying to find ways to make purchases of energy for their operations. And then finally, transmission, the electric superhighway of the future, the electric interstate superhighway of the future. Think of Eisenhower's vision for the interstate highway system of the 1950s. We have never thought about how to move power around in our country in the same way, and yet from an economic perspective, it will give us a lot of opportunities in the future to take power, cheap power from where it's generated and to where it's used in the load centers. So AWEA is particularly focused on making sure that that is a part of our decision-making process. And let me just kind of wrap up with why we think community engagement is important. AWEA is particularly invested in Nebraska. We will provide, through our PAC, campaign contributions. We also focus on legislative strategy and having good representation here in the state. And we also believe in policy support. So inside AWEA, we have state affairs, which focuses on those three things that I just described. But we also have federal affairs, we have a research component, and then we also have public affairs. And it's our public affairs program where we've invested in New Power Nebraska. And we believe in the current environment that folks who are super empowered may have high opinions but low information and try to influence elected officials, that vacuum will be filled with whatever information they're providing in the process, and that we have to be proactive and make sure that we're providing good information to the policymakers, the kind of evidence that you saw in the Holt County panel of real-life examples of where this really makes a difference. But for filling that information vacuum, a lot of the negativity does influence the decisions. And so we think it's an obligation at AWEA to help our member companies create what policy geeks call a social license for those projects to be accepted in the communities and to move forward. And so we consider us a complete partner with Nebraska, and in New Power Nebraska, that investment is making a difference. So appreciate being a part of the panel and look forward to questions later.
Our next panelist is Josh Moaning with New Power Nebraska.
Thank you, and thank you, Jeff, for those comments. As Jeff focused in on the national outlook for wind energy, I'm going to touch base on Nebraska and our effort called New Power Nebraska to be a resource for telling the positive story about wind development across our state. This effort began about a year and a half ago. Get this started. About a year and a half ago, I started working directly with AWEA, and I want to emphasize that this investment that AWEA has made in Nebraska is a big deal in our state. This isn't happening everywhere. There were 4 or 5 state pilot programs that were started about this time, and Nebraska was one of those, as evidence of AWEA seeing the potential growth in Nebraska. And so what we do is really shine a light on the benefits that wind energy is bringing to our rural communities and rural places through the production of clean, affordable power, new farm income opportunities for landowners, and new jobs. And we go about this work in 3 different categories: public affairs and education, grassroots organization, and policy support. So I'll roll through those here fairly quickly. Public affairs work. You see here, there we go. Wind farm tours is one of the things that we do. We help organize and coordinate getting local and state elected officials out to wind farm production sites. In a lot of cases, we see that, especially at the county level, the wind industry in a state like Nebraska that is somewhat underdeveloped compared to our peer states, it's still a new thing, and there's a lot of unfamiliarity. So these county officials that don't know a whole lot about it are pretty easily subject to believe a lot of the misinformation that surfaces when these discussions start. So one remedy to that is getting people out to existing farms. In this instance, this is in Antelope County. Majority of the people here were actually Madison County officials, county commissioners and planning commissioners who were considering Madison County's zoning regulations. And we found that getting them to a neighboring county where wind farms have existed for a number of years so they could see and hear for themselves what this is all about and talk to their fellow commissioners and officials in other counties really helped in the planning process in Madison County. And lo and behold, Madison County passed some very reasonable regulations for development. We do this across the state. This is Wayne County in the bottom left. That's Lieutenant Governor Mike Foley, who visited the Shoals Project in Wayne County. We also do community engagement here in Norfolk, which is kind of situated in the middle of a lot of our wind generation. We've hosted the Wind Harvest Festival for the 2nd year in a row, and so we have member companies who come to the event. This is an ongoing community festival. Bring materials. It's an education opportunity to reach out to people in the Norfolk and surrounding region. These are my kids. They get drug along to some of these events. Usually have to bribe them somehow, but they're my little helpers. This is a county fair in Nuckolls County. I'll just mention this. Wind Week is in August, and this year we were able to work with the governor's office to issue a proclamation recognizing Wind Week and the impacts that wind energy have had in the state. We also were able to get 11 different proclamations from cities across Nebraska. Northeast Community College, and we really like to highlight this, and you saw some folks from Northeast here this week at the conference. This is the only full-fledged wind energy training program in the state. I've heard it called among the top 3 programs in the nation. They do a great job. Enrollment has increased over the last few years. These kids who had graduated maybe 10 years ago, the program's about 10 years old, at that time were having to travel to other states to find jobs, can now work in Nebraska with the new development coming on. Again, wind farm tours. Congressman Bacon joined us earlier this year. That led to an op-ed that he published in The Hill, touting wind energy benefits in correlation with military siting and how those things can be compatible. This is in Steel Flats in southeast Nebraska. Also, we highlight community engagement opportunities that our member companies take part in. Earned media is also a big part of what we do, coordinating op-ed pieces in our larger daily newspapers. John Hansen here has been featured, has written one of those. You'll see other recognized leaders in the industry in the state, making sure that we have a high level of engagement in the public dialogue on wind energy development. This piece was featured in the World Herald in June, and it focused in on the Facebook arrangement, the Facebook data center, which was built outside Papillion, and really the only reason that Facebook came here to Nebraska was its ability to buy Nebraska wind power, and the connection of that corporate investment to the Rattlesnake Creek project in Dixon County. And also letters to the editor, so we organize our advocates and encourage people to make sure their voices are heard in their local and regional newspapers, talking about the benefits of new job creation, changing markets in wind energy, new opportunities for farmers and ag producers. We've also coordinated a paid media campaign with the support of our member companies, and through that we've featured Nebraska voices. We find that it's most effective to have Nebraskans talking to Nebraskans about how wind works and how it's affecting their communities. So here is Chelsea Bohr. She is an operations planner in Antelope County, in Vinergy site. Sam Becker, who is a Northeast Community College graduate who just took a job at that Rattlesnake Creek wind farm I mentioned, and Amy Shane, who you saw yesterday in that Holt County panel, the superintendent of schools at O'Neill, talking about how her school has been empowered to expand and renovate a project that they've been trying to do for a long time. Now it's financed through wind farm taxes. And so the coverage of this campaign has been widespread. These print ads have ran in 150 plus weekly and daily newspapers across the state, also supplemented with a radio campaign and digital campaign. AWEA also dedicated resources last fall. We set up different interviews. It's an instructor from Northeast Community College. I won't go through the whole video for time's sake, but you can find it on our website at New Power Nebraska. Grassroots organizations. So we maintain a database of advocates, and we currently have 250 plus allies across the state, people who are willing to engage in local and state level discussions on wind energy development. So we help coordinate testimony in some cases at different hearings and forums. We keep people engaged and up to date on what's happening in Nebraska wind through a monthly newsletter that we publish. We've also called upon our advocates to engage at the state level on policy matters. Last year, when a couple of anti-wind bills were working through the legislature, we generated about 150 signatures from people across the state opposing those bills and urging lawmakers to support growing momentum in Nebraska wind. Also have a heavy social media presence. which has grown quite rapidly over the last year. Policy support, again, both at the state and local levels, empowering people with information to feel comfortable in standing up and being vocal in support for wind energy development in their areas. And I guess lastly, I'd want to say that we can be a resource for you, whether you're a developer or an advocate, a clean energy advocate. Please use the tools we have at our disposal to help promote projects in your area, or simply voice support for the increased development of renewable resources across the state. So, thank you.
Our last presentation is a dual presentation by Brad Wilken and Mike Laird with Olsson on the additional tools available to project developers and project proponents for additional stakeholder engagement.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Josh. So, as Josh was saying, there's a lot of positive potential out there for Nebraska and wind energy and renewable energy in total. So, if everybody's for it, then how do we face the opposition when it comes intact? So, there's a Berkeley study done a while back, and judging who is in favor for a project before. I mean, this was done following construction of it. So as you can see, there's a very 8% that only had a negative aspect for it. Now, during that aspect too, another portion of the study was when the client was open and transparent with the development, that swayed their opposition to the project as well. So even though they were against it, as long as everybody was upfront, open, transparent through the whole process and try to get the community involved, they were less opposed to the project after being built too as well. So out of that study too, the positives, compensation, perception, general attitudes, all great things that everybody's been saying the entire day yesterday and today. Now the negatives on sound, turbine, stakeholders, shadow flicker, the main key words and the buzzwords people have been hearing on the opposition. How do we combat that stuff and give people the correct information instead of the misinformation that's been spread apart in those conversations? So noise and shadow flicker, and a lot of it's perception, right? A lot of it's nuisance on the noise of, what are you able to tolerate? What are you not able to tolerate? Do you find an issue that being outside your natural resources too as well, how it impacts you in general? So there's been a lot of studies with it, but it is still perception. It's what people feel about it and how they're going to view the wind farm or the solar farm. The shadow flicker study. We can basically create a visual so people realize what that range is. So in Nebraska, we did a test case of putting a turbine up, running it at the solstice, and then the equinox too as well, and then getting basically a butterfly spread upon the horizon. We then took a radius out every 100 feet so people can see kind of a setback alignment of it. This isn't to actually judge and set setbacks for it, but it's just a communication device used to explain to the public that who you're talking to exactly what they're looking at. I mean, so if you can see within the 500-foot radius, there's a lot of shadows. This is done every 10 seconds, and this is 30-minute in comparison. I'm sorry, 10-minute to 30-minute. So I think the nuisance was about 30 minutes per day is where it was kind of deemed at to be a nuisance for shadow flicker. So as you can see, when it gets in that 300 to 500 feet, you're going to be hitting those kind of marks. And we've overlaid these maps too as well along aerial maps of the whole community. That way people can actually see their farmsteads, houses, impacts for the cities, and see what that spread comes across. And even though the spread actually is pretty wide, it's only going to be there for maybe a minute, 2 minutes a day. And when you overlay the weather patterns too on top of this too as well, it becomes less of an issue. You're not going to have sunny days the entire year round. You're going to have overcast. What time of the day are you going to be in your residence? What time are you going to be in your community? It will all be judged and kind of allocated within the visuals. glint and glare studies too as well. What's that solar farm going to look like? Everybody's up for renewables. Everybody wants renewables, and a lot of things have been said, but they don't want to see it, right? So the glint and glare, the main aspect of it is for aeronautical purposes too as well. Around airports, you get some glint and glare when it's noon at a 6-foot eyesight for any pedestrian. Other than that, the main aspect of aeronautical, is that going to affect inbound and outbound traffic, and how is that going to affect it? So we create simulations to actually showcase what that's going to look like. The same thing with wind turbines too as well. So when a client comes up and saying, well, we're going to put a 300-meter wind turbine up, and this is what the farm's going to look like, immediately the community, if they're opposed to the project, they're going to think the worst case scenario. They're going to think the most highest structure they're going to be able to see, that's going to be a nuisance. What we're able to do with the visual is actually show that turbine in any location throughout the entire community, so they know exactly what it's going to look like and the impact of it. That gives the right tools to our community members and our stakeholders to actually communicate it in a positive manner, as well as the static simulations here in the middle too as well. We go on site, we take the images of the actual key observation points detected within the community, and then we overlay that wind farm on top of it, so they know exactly what this is going to look like in the proposed build. A few other examples of just kind of those kind of renderings, what those look like. And with solar panels, we take the engineering specs, in these models, same thing with the turbines too as well, to get as realistic depiction of that as possible. We can also animate the wind turbine path, shadow flicker, the solar panels, if they're going to be tilting with the sun. We replicate that too as well and provide stills or videos with that. But the main point is just to bridge any language and technical gaps and technical expertise gaps that the public has. The more people are informed, the more education that you can kind of bestow upon them to make the most accurate decision and kind of overcome that negative aspect they've been kind of hearing in the background, right? Anyone wants to make a good decision, they need to know exactly what's going on. And mostly everybody here, technical experts, seen a lot of different stuff around here. We need to communicate that to our communities, and we need to do it in a tolerable fashion that they're able to see. Pictures worth 1,000 words, 30 frames per second in video. It adds up in a hurry. And you're able to share this too as well, not only in public meetings, but on social media, on the web, so people can see exactly what it looks like, and we're able to judge the perception of the way these things look. With the images and the videos, you're able to present it in a positive manner and just push that positive aspect of it that everybody, feels that, the renewables are going forth through Nebraska. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Brad. I'm Mike Laird. I head up the drone program at Olsson. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've been able to use drones as a tool to engage stakeholders in wind energy development. We have several drones that we use here. Typically use the smaller, quieter drones whenever we can. And we now have a LiDAR drone in the bottom right for dense mapping. One of the first requests I had, it would be to, in the process of micrositing, where the engineer has laid out his wind farm on the desktop, then he would go to the field and want to see exactly where those turbines lay to make sure they're not on a well or oil well or things like that. So traditionally they've been driving across the land and walking, opening fences to go see each site. But we came up with a method where they can watch a monitor in the back of an SUV, and I program the drone. They give me the points of where the turbines are proposed to go and the roads, and they can sit in the SUV while the drone flies. Excuse me. This way they can see a high up aerial view and then also a low to the ground view where we need to inspect something. So micrositing is something that we've used it for, surveying and mapping the original site, crop damage mapping, which I'll discuss a little bit about, some transmission line inspections, post pre and post documentation and environmental observations. This is just an example of what the drone will show you for micrositing. Crop damage mapping is something that in the past they've done just by sending surveyors on foot to outline the areas that were disturbed in the construction. And sometimes you get some arguments over if they actually mapped it all and what the process was. So instead, we developed this method where you take a site that's the undisturbed site before development. This is the imaging, the map that the drone will create overlaid in Google Earth that shows all of the construction and the crop damage. You can outline it and come up with an acreage, and then you can deliver this directly to the client as a KMZ file that they can look at or save or just have a record of exactly what was done to the land. That's an entire wind farm site in Oklahoma afterwards, and if you can tell, you can see all of the new areas that were mapped by the drone overlaid in Google Earth. And then, of course, just project progress, photos and documentation of exactly what was done, and then post-project marketing and photography. And we'll open it up to questions now. Amanda?
Since we've gone high-tech, I had to get my phone to check Slido if anyone had any questions. Again, the key to all of this is stakeholder engagement and encouraging the community to get involved earlier on in the process to the benefits of wind energy as a clean power source, a new farm income, and positive impacts to the community. So our panelists have provided the national perspective for wind, the Nebraska forward perspective for wind, and then various tools to communicate those positive aspects to wind. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the Slido app for those questions, or additionally in the openness of wind energy, feel free to also just stand up and shout your questions. Positively shout them. So the question to the panelists are how to engage proponents for a wind project, those for the project, to get more actively involved in a project versus those who are against the project who tend to be louder.
So you raise basically the essential question of how do we actually get social acceptance for the project. And I think one of the ironies of the information age is that we have greater access to information, but a lower understanding and the ability to work together because people can silo themselves by self-selecting either Facebook or other information sites, and then that becomes their reality. And so, one, you have to be intentional about empowering people to be able to engage in those public discussions. Those that are in the public discussions need to be willing to show up and manage the conflict, the conversation, if you will, in a professional way. And so to fill that vacuum of information with good information, facts and evidence still do matter. It doesn't seem like it in the entertainment age that we're in terms of public policy, but facts and evidence still do matter, being transparent and forthright, but also being intentional about it. So it doesn't just happen. You have to invest in the framework of being able to help people work through those issues at the local level. So a military analogy would be to provide air and ground cover for the decision makers, the community folks that support it, and to manage that process. And so that's why we make intentional investments in AWEA in public affairs, and that's where New Power Nebraska would come in to help with those decision processes at the local level.
I think that the presentation this morning, particularly the Polk County example, was very powerful in terms of communication up front, as regularly as possible, filling that void. We've seen it time and time again. When the discussion surfaces about wind development in places that are unfamiliar with it, you're going to have very vocal people. It's usually a minority, but they're very loud and unafraid to intimidate other people. And to counter that, you have to have a resource, and a resource that's coming from Nebraska Voices, I think, to combat that with real information about how this has worked. We're mature enough in the process of wind development in the state now that we can use real-life examples from Nebraska counties that have seen benefits and have therefore borne out advocates who are willing to speak. So there's also a safety in numbers thing. If you can identify a number of local advocates who are willing to stand up, it makes it easier if they come as a group than it is on an individual level. So.
The question is regarding health effects and wind energy.
Yep. So we take seriously every critique. A part of the process for helping not only elected officials, but local community leaders, neighbors, and stakeholders is that we take every critique seriously. On health effects, there have been numerous studies, and there isn't a single study that has shown negative health effects of wind farms. University of Iowa just released one this year through their health portion of the college. And what they found is there is a nuisance outcome, but it does not affect scientifically anybody's health. And so there are a number of myths, if you will. And so we think it's important, if people do have those questions, that we have an evidence-based way of answering them. Yep, and so you should know the current literature is there is no health effects for a wind farm beyond nuisance, which is, you heard in the presentation, people have a chance to kind of see where they're sited and how they're actually a part of the landscape. You can help at least those that are open to evidence be able to support that decision, and that's the kind of work that we do. Yeah, if you go to AWEA, you can actually Google it. It's all public, but it also after this, if you want to follow up, I can give you the link to it.
Believe it or not, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between cancer rates and proximity to wind farms.
Again, thank you to all of our panelists for participating this morning.